is George. All right. Aloha mai kako. Welcome to After Dark in the Park. I am really looking forward to tonight's program. This is incredible. I know it's a little rainy, cold volcano night, but it's good to see so many faces out here. Folks ask us, where do we get the ideas for After Darks? Because there's always a wide array of programs for After Dark in the Park. Well, some of them, they recruit rangers for our different divisions from many different backgrounds. We have folks with a background in geology and volcanology. We have an anthropologist that works with our team, folks like me that worked in conservation biology, and then we actually have somebody whose background is as a historian, and that's Ranger Ben Hayes. He's not only our manager of the Interpretation and Education Division, but highly sought after. He even does programs all the way in the South Pacific about World War II type programs, which is really incredible. So I'm really grateful to be able to welcome him here tonight. He's going to take us through the Battle of Midway, because we are on the anniversary of Midway, but he's going to do it from a Japanese perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Hayes.
Aloha ahi ahi mai kako.
Aloha.
It's a pleasure to be with you here this evening. As Dean said, my name is Ben Hayes, and I am a park ranger here at Hawai Volcanoes National Park. But I also was a park ranger at a place called War in the Pacific National Historical Park on the island of Guam, which was like right about here. And worked there for 5 years, and I became very immersed and interested in the Pacific theater of World War II. And I was able to visit some of the battle sites, of course, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, even Hiroshima, Tokyo, Peleliu, Philippines, and here in Hawaii and Oahu. And so today, as a park ranger and historian, we get to tell stories. And so I'm going to tell you a story this evening. It is a Japanese perspective, not the Japanese perspective whatsoever. There are many perspectives. But for this evening, we're going to look at the Battle of Midway. It happened 81 years ago this week. This battle changed the trajectory of the Pacific War. And often the focus is about the American perspective and the American military experience in that battle. But today we're going to look at the Japanese military perspective. We're going to look at some of the reasons why Japan decided to fight this battle. We're going to look at their plan. What were they trying to do? And we're going to look at some of the decisions that the Japanese leaders made in the battle, and then if they learned anything as an outcome. So for 60 years, our understanding as Americans of the Battle of Midway was built on 3 primary source areas. The first is, of course, the American military who participated in the battle. That's the leaders, that's the sailors, the airmen, the soldiers, the Marines, and all those who fought, and of course all those who led. They generated a lot of records, and those perspectives are very valuable and important, but it doesn't give us the entire picture of what happened at Midway. Another source was a battle report written by Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, which was captured on Saipan. And this is Nagumo on Saipan a few months before he's going to take his own life after the Battle of Saipan in 1944. Probably the most important Japanese source for the first 60 years after the battle was this gentleman right here, Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who was commander of the Japanese air group on Akagi. He wrote a book later called Midway, the Battle That Doomed Japan, the Japanese Navy story. And that really became canon in our understanding of what happened for many, many decades. But there are deficiencies in these sources. There's not enough of the Japanese perspective. And the American sources are going to dominate this telling of this story for decades, and it's going to result in some mythology building and a misunderstanding of what actually happened. A lot of what I'm sharing is from this book, Shattered Sword, written by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully. I'm proud to call John Parshall a friend of mine. But what they do, and why this is a break in the historiography, is they introduced so many new sources, probably the most important of which are loads and loads of ship logs, flight logs, and records that were actually saved when these ships sank. And that really pinpoints when things happen on those carriers. And they have a lot of additional eyewitnesses that they're able to have access to that tells what was going on the decks of these carriers of the Kilauea. And they conclude many of Fujiya's claims were wrong in his book. So before we go into the Japanese perspective, let's just do a quick run-through of the battle, Midway 101, so everyone's on the same page, a little refresher for some of you. Okay, December 8th, 1941, Japan attacks Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore, Malaya, Guam, the Philippines, and across the dateline here in Hawaii, attacks Oahu. This attack brings the United States into World War II, the last major power to enter the war. These surprise attacks are all part of the Japanese goal to capture resource areas, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, particularly looking at oil. In 4 months, Japan captured one of the largest empires in human history, with over 500 million people under the emperor. And they achieved almost all of their pre-war combat objectives with remarkable ease and efficiency. It was incredible. By April, Japan develops a plan to capture Midway Atoll in early June. However, the Americans have broken the Japanese Naval Code JN-25B and are aware a Japanese attack is coming. And pictured are the cryptologist team working in Oahu as part of the 14th Naval District. So with this information, Commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz orders his subordinate Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to take the last 3 American carriers to ambush the Japanese carriers. Nimitz formulates a plan to send the 3 carriers under Fletcher's command to a position northeast of Midway called Point Luck and wait. And after the Japanese attack Midway, if the conditions are good, Fletcher will launch a surprise attack on the Japanese carriers. But Nimitz is clear to Fletcher, do not risk the carriers. If things go sideways, get out of there. And that's part of the whole point of Point Luck. He can escape easily. The U.S. forces consist of 2 task forces surrounded by which are basically built up on 2 carrier groups. The first is Task Force 16, which includes the Hornet and the Enterprise. And then Task Force 17, which only has 1 carrier, the Yorktown. The Yorktown is pictured here in dry dock at Pearl just before the battle. And maybe some of you know why that is, but Yorktown was just in another battle and had taken the Japanese bomb hit at the Battle of Coral Sea only a month prior and was repaired in 48 hours just so it was battle worthy and then sent up to Point Luck. The battle begins with the Japanese launching a strike on Midway at 04:30 on June 4th, 1942. And just a quick rundown of all these squiggly lines and numbers here. So, Japanese bomb Midway, but they already see that a second strike is needed. So, at the same time, small groups of U.S. planes from Midway attack the Japanese fleet, but are mostly destroyed. But by 10:22 to 10:27, U.S. dive bombers from the carriers find the Japanese carriers without air cover and mortally wound 3 of them. The remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launches strikes on Yorktown, mortally wounding that carrier. The U.S. carrier planes then counterattack Hiryu, mortally wound it, and all 4 Japanese carriers are sunk, and Yorktown sinks on June 6th. This is what really matters most to the Americans in this battle. More than keeping Midway are sinking these 4 ships, the most important part of the entire Japanese fleet. This is the Kilauea. So, Midway is called the most decisive naval battle in U.S. history. It ends the Japanese initiative of the Pacific War and gives the U.S. carrier parity with Japan. And they use that to launch the first offensive of the war for the Americans at Guadalcanal. So, let's now take a step back and think about the Japanese perspective. Why Midway? I'm going to read you a segment from Shattered Sword. The Battle of Midway was fought by Japanese men who were products of an intensely disciplined, patriarchal, militarized, and above all, Eastern society. Understanding the battle without comprehending their emotional and cultural outlook is pointless. When it entered World War II, Japan was an intensely nationalistic country with a deeply held resentment of white imperialism. It was surrounded by European colonial states all around it, one of the few nations that was able to remain undominated by either Europe or the United States. However, honor, duty, family, and doing one's utmost were much more than words. They were paramount values. Discipline in the military services was rigid, and training was violent, brutal, and dehumanizing. However, the officer class sometimes lashed out and acted insubordinately, launching coups against the civilian government, twice invading China without orders from Tokyo, massacring civilians in China, and engaging in alcohol-fueled brawls. So, the Japanese military force is perhaps more definable by its contrasts than anything else. It was an organization that was both ferocious and sentimental. It was an organization that was, where extreme loyalty and discipline were matched by an equal aptitude for brutal behavior towards the rank and file, and a callous disregard for the lives of its men. As events were about to prove, it had put in the hard work necessary to be technically and tactically astute, but it had not matched those efforts with the mental exertion needed to operate at the higher strategic levels required by a global war. So, first is what is the Japanese doctrine? What do they use as their instructions on how to fight war? That's what we're going to look at first. And that's called decisive battle doctrine. In 1905, Japan fought the Empire of Russia, and in one battle, the Battle of Tsushima, defeated the Russian fleet and won the war. This is going to lead to Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. The objective of the fleet is to destroy the enemy's main force in a single battle. This is the theory that the Japanese Navy was operating under. And how did that manifest into the Pacific Japanese combined fleet? How did it use that doctrine to deliver that battle? In 1942, this is the most potent, experienced, and effective carrier force on the planet, having destroyed not only American, but British, Dutch, Australian naval forces and bases throughout the Pacific and Indian Ocean. From left to right, you got Akagi, Kaga, and you got Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. So the Kido-Butai doctrine is going to operate as a multi-carrier unit. They are designed to launch massive airstrikes with as many planes as possible on the enemy simultaneously. The planes and ships, the planes and the ship that they sit on are one unit as well. This is a hyper-aggressive, fast-tempo doctrine, and it is nothing personifies it more than the Kido-Butai. Also important to mention naval aviators and crews. These are the most experienced and deadly in the world. They are trained to be aggressive and to always do your utmost. One point to note, they are not rotated out to instruct the next generation. So for these men aboard the carriers, there are three ways they will leave: death, the ship sinks, or the war ends. And the tools. No carrier is worth anything without planes. These are the three main weapons in their carrier toolbox. First, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Mitsubishi A6M fighter, aka the Zero, and that's at the top. And the Aichi D3A Titan IM carrier bomber, aka the Bow. And the Nakajima B5N torpedo bomber, aka the Kate. These planes are designed to be long-range attack planes. They are some of the most advanced designs when the war began in 1941, but are already showing age in mid-1942. The design sacrifices to make them longer range aircraft meant that they were vulnerable to machine gun fire and flak. They could not take much damage. And also, the Zero, the fighter, only carries 7 seconds of cannon ammunition. It's important to keep that in mind for what we're going to talk about next, about combat air patrol. So how do these carriers defend themselves? There are 3 ways, or 3 lines of defense for an aircraft carrier, and it's also true for the Americans. The first is combat air patrol, and that is the priority, the most effective, and number 1 line of defense. Those are fighters flying above the carriers, shooting down any planes that come close. Second is anti-aircraft fire, but the Japanese anti-aircraft fire is very poor and insufficient. And the gun you see is the Type 96 25mm gun, and that is just a terrible gun. It is obsolete. It's a 30s gun, a French Hotchkiss design, and it just can't train, maneuver, elevate, and traverse very fast. And you see the magazines only have just a few rounds in them. You got to put them in and load them. It's just a nightmare. The final line of defense is evasive maneuvers, and that's what's going down right here, a tight circle. And that is steering away from attacking planes, steering away from bomb hits, and trying to avoid your ship being in a perfect lineup for the attacking planes. Operations. Carrier flight decks in World War II can only do one thing at a time. They can spot planes, they can launch planes, or they can recover planes. But they can't do any of those things at once, or together. Torpedo bombers are armed below in the hangar deck, whereas the dive bombers are armed on the flight deck itself. And, most importantly, if a carrier is under attack, those flight decks are cleared for combat air patrol replenishment. Remember, those fighters have how many seconds of cannon? 7 seconds. And then they got to go down and get more and refuel. So that flight deck has to be clear. What are some of the weaknesses of these carriers? Well, none of these have armored flight decks. And the Americans don't either, but the British have some armored flight decks, so it's not like it doesn't exist. Little or no armor on 4 of the 6 carriers. And we'll talk about which ones have no armor a little later. Or I'll talk about right now, actually. The Akagi and Kaga are converted, whereas the Hiryu, Soryu, the Shokaku, and Zuikaku are all purpose-built aircraft carriers. But the Akagi is a converted battle cruiser, and the Kaga is a converted battleship. So they're going to have a little more armor than the other ships, but not on their hangar decks. That's the key. The biggest, and also the pilots are really good at attacking things, so they're going to have a little bit of target fixation, as we'll see. None of these ships have radar. The Americans do, and that's really underappreciated in this battle. And the biggest weakness in Achilles' heel, insufficient damage control in these carriers. So, Coral Sea, we talked about the impact of the Yorktown a little earlier. It's going to impact the Kido Butai as well. May 4th through 8, 1942, the battle was part of an attempt to invade Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby. And 2 Japanese carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, are involved in that battle. The Zuikaku air group was wiped out, while the Shokaku was severely damaged. Japanese carrier doctrine is the planes and ship are one unit. So as a consequence, Both of those ships are going to sit out Midway. You could, if it was been an American doctrine, you would have taken the planes from the Shokaku and put them on the Zuikaku and send it out. But that is not part of their doctrine, and it's not considered. All right, let's talk about not a really existent war strategy, which the muddled decision-making led to Midway. So as we mentioned earlier, Japan captured in 4 months a huge, massive empire. But it was led by Prime Minister Tojo, who was both Prime Minister and War Minister. And they didn't have an answer for the question, now what do we do? There was simply no strategy to win the war. And that's going to be some really muddled decision-making for the leaders. It's going to be decisions that are based on compromise and not on strategic, sound factors. The big picture in 1942, the Army wants to continue the fight against China. It's been going on since 1937. They have not been successful in ending that war. It's actually what drives Japan to invade the resource areas. So they have one option: consolidate your wins and fortify. But no one wants to do that. They haven't won, they haven't lost a battle yet. And so they want to continue to expand. Option 2, invade Australia. The Army says, are you kidding me? We don't have the troops for that. We can't even win here in China. So that's off the table. Option 3, invade India. Same reason. That's also really a lot further. So no. And option 4, press on through the Southwest Pacific, Fiji, New Caledonia, the Solomon Islands, Samoa. And that's a viable option. And then option 5, Central Pacific to Hawaii. On the left is Chief of the Japanese Navy General Staff, Admiral Nagano Osami. Nagano wants to go to the south. And on the right is his subordinate, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku. Yamamoto wanted to go to the Central Pacific, to Hawaii. Yamamoto got his way. This is going to be his biggest gamble of the war. Target is Midway. It's part of the Hawaiian Island chain, 1,300 miles from Oahu, and 5,000 miles from Japan. There are 2 small eastern and Sand Island, you see here. Very, very tiny as far as islands go. And there is, though, a airfield on Eastern Island. But Yamamoto's goal is, by capturing these islands, the Americans are not going to compensate. They're going to come out with their carriers and give him that decisive battle that he's been hoping for. So why Midway? And now we're looking at Yamamoto's gamble, how he really took a lot of risk in planning this. He was going to come up with Operation Me. It is vast and incredibly complex. I mean, unbelievable the amount of area this operation is going to include. It assumed that Japan would have the element of surprise, which we know they don't. But it was, the fundamental flaw was, it was based on what Yamamoto thought the U.S. would do, and not on what the U.S. could do. And without the Shokaku and Zuikaku, there is not enough planes to both capture Midway and then fight the decisive carrier battle. It is a huge gamble driven by Yamamoto to do just that. And you gotta be thinking, by this point in time, 6 months, gotta be a little bit of arrogance going on, some hubris, some what the emperor called victory disease. So the Japanese forces are led by Commander-in-Chief Yamamoto, and on the right, his subordinate, commander of the Kirubutai, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo's job is to take out the American carriers with a new base established at Midway, and the American carriers destroyed. Yamamoto believes he can then move to capture the Hawaiian Islands. But let's take a look at all of these lines and squiggles. And this is the Japanese plan. 7 large naval forces. Most of the entire combined fleet are going to be part of this operation. It involves the 1st Carrier Strike Force, Kilauea, and they're going to come up here from the northwest of Midway. It involves the main body, where Yamamoto is actually on the part of the main body, but they're hundreds of miles behind the Kilauea. It involves an invasion force, an occupation force, various guard forces, and it involves, oh yeah, we got over here, an Alaska force, Alaska Strike Force. Yes, this battle does include both Midway and the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. Yes, they are almost 2,000 miles apart. It is not clear why both targets were part of the same operation, but it probably was from compromises that the leaders were making in order to make their decisions. But what if the 2 Japanese carriers that were assigned to the Aleutian Islands had been instead attached to Kilauea for Midway? So the first step is to capture Midway and the Aleutians at the same time. And there's been some historians that argue that, well, the Aleutians were just a feint, but if they were feint, then why did they happen at the same time? They weren't. They were part of a combined campaign. Step 2, the American carriers sortie from Pearl and fight the decisive battle and are destroyed. Step 3, the Aleutian forces come and join the Midway forces to mop up anything that's left. Step 5, the United States sues for peace. Let's look at the planes available they're bringing with them. 227 total. As you see, most of the planes are either dive bomber or torpedo attack planes. They're very similar from carrier to carrier in the makeup of their individual groups. But now let's compare with what they're going to face. The mythology that the U.S. was outnumbered, the U.S. was the underdog in this battle, focuses on the huge Japanese fleet. But most of those forces will be hundreds of miles away and will not participate in the battle or even get close to Midway. This battle is all about who can launch the most planes at the enemy fleet. With the Midway-based planes, the United States had over 100 more airplanes than Japan. The American advantage of radar is also underappreciated. With radar, the Americans can detect the Japanese on their way from much greater distances, where the Japanese, their detection is the Mark I eyeball. Not only that, Nimitz gives a peculiar order to Nagumo. You may only use half of your planes to attack Midway. The rest must be kept in reserve for that decisive battle. That is very, very restrictive for your tactical commander. It only allows Nagumo 108 planes to strike Midway, and he knows, in fact, even his his air groups know that's not going to be enough to neutralize the defenses on the island. And in fact, he's ordered that he can't even use his reserve planes until the carriers have sortied from Pearl. Could be days. Here's one final point of criticism with the Japanese plan. This is the air reconnaissance plan for the Kilauea. Nagumo sends only 7 planes to search an area 176,000 square miles. This is completely insufficient. As per doctrine, no carrier planes are part of the search. They only use float planes from the cruisers and battleships. So there's also an area of a little more communication is required to get that information to Nagumo. Again, Japan has, this really shows that the Japanese leaders have predetermined that the American ships are still at Pearl. So the search is not expected to find anything. And one float plane from the cruiser Chikama actually flies directly over Task Force 17 and doesn't see it. So the battle begins. Here we go. It's 04:30, June 4th, 1942. 108 planes of the 1st Strike Force launch in only 10 minutes to launch 108 planes from your carriers. This is a really experienced group of aviators. Uh-oh, at 05:34, the Kilauea is spotted. A flying boat from Midway spots the Japanese ships. 06:20, Japanese strike hits Midway. 11 Japanese planes are shot down in this attack. 14 planes are heavily damaged, and 29 planes are lightly damaged. Although there is some damage to Midway, particularly their fuel facility, the airfield remains operational. And as he departs the area at 0700, Strike Commander Lieutenant Tamanaga radios back to Nagumo that we're going to need another strike. But nearly 1/4 of these planes are done in this one attack. At 0710, Midway-based squadrons of Avengers and B-26 Marauders attack the Kilauea. 23 of the 30 Avengers are shot down. 4 Marauders are lost. Only 2 Zeros are lost. No hits on the Kilauea. The skill and experience of our Japanese pilots is clearly evident in the attack, and this is not the American A-Team. Nagumo orders a second attack at 7:15. He orders his reserve planes to prepare to attack, going against Yamamoto's orders. That means the torpedo bombers must be rearmed with conventional bombs. That happens in the hangar deck. Suddenly, air crews are working feverishly below deck to rearm the planes. Then the worst thing possible happens. At 0745, a search plane from the cruiser Tone reports 10 U.S. surface ships 240 miles northeast of Midway. This was a complete shock for the officers and for Nagumo. It is difficult to overstate how stunned Nagumo and his officers were. The presence of American ships in this location completely undermines the assumptions of Yamamoto's plan. Did the Americans know we were coming? So Nagumo cancels the order to rearm the torpedo planes and orders the torpedoes to be put back on and cancels the attack on Midway. This is what begins a 15-minute window called Nagumo's Dilemma. The U.S. fleet is spotted at 7:45. 86 of his planes are in the air returning from the Midway strike, having been in the air for 4 hours and are running out of fuel. None of his reserve strike planes in the hangar decks are ready. It will take 45 minutes to bring them up, fuel, load, warm up, and then launch. But carriers can only do one thing at a time. Launching a strike force may force the returning Japanese planes to ditch, starting at 8:45. So Nagumo has 15 minutes to decide if he's going to wait for the strike to return or if he's going to send a strike out now. So what do you think he does? He's going to wait for that strike to return. And this is doctrine. Again, decisive battle doctrine. You launch all your planes together. And so he's going to land his planes. It is the conservative thing to do. Nagumo is a conservative admiral, but it is difficult to imagine any other admiral in his position to decide differently. But I think a lot is made of Nagumo's dilemma, and it kind of forgets that, oh wait, the Americans are back. They're going to decide for Nagumo. Even if he was deciding to launch, they're going to basically stop the clock, or keep the clock running, I should say. They're going to attack, and then these are Midway-based planes at 7:53. They are unescorted, 27 Dauntless dive bombers, or Douglas dive bombers, in 2 groups, 15 B-17 Flying Fortresses, 10 SBDs are lost, only 3 Zeros are lost, no hits to the ships. But what's really interesting about the B-17 is that it's bombing from 20,000 feet. And the Japanese had a saying, if they heard planes coming, but they saw their B-17s, they knew everything would be okay. Because they're not very accurate from 20,000 feet. But they did snap some really interesting pictures that tell us what's going on in these flight decks. Let's get a little closer. Anyone see any planes? No. Here's another one. And this one is the Akagi. This is the Soryu. Anyone see a plane? Oh, there's one. In the back. It's a fighter. Remember, 7 seconds of cannon fire. And then this is the Hiryu. Notice the bombs hitting over there. And let's see if we got any planes. Oh, we got 2. So at 8:35, the last of that U.S. attack is gone. And now the decision has been made for Nagumo. He's going to land those planes. They're running on fumes. And by 9:10, they are all on deck. Then, more American attacks. At 9:20 to 10:20, 3 carrier-based squadrons attack Kido-Butai. All 15 of the VT-8 Devastators are lost, every one of them. 9 of the 14 VT-6 Devastators are also lost. 10 of 12 VT-3 torpedo bombers are lost. Only 1 Zero is lost. No hits to Kido-Butai. But here's what makes this attack the second most important. It has drawn the Japanese combat air patrol away from the carriers. There's some debate if they went way down low, but the rate of climb that these planes have, I don't think so. I think it's lateral draw away from the carriers. Here's the situation at 10:22. The Japanese cap of 42 fighters has flown east to intercept VT-3, leaving the carriers undefended. At that moment, by sheer luck, 3 dive bomber squadrons, 50 planes, launched from different carriers at different times, just happened to show up at the same time. Let's look at these hangar decks. This is inside a Japanese carrier hangar after the war. Japanese carriers had multiple hangar decks, unlike the U.S. carriers that did not. And this is after the war, so it's empty. So let's get a sense by looking at a British. British also had multi-carrier decks. So this is Cold War British, but this is pretty crowded. It's full of equipment, not just planes, but pieces of planes and bombs. And that is how these hangar decks may have looked at 10:22 on June 4th, 1942. Once these hangar decks were hit, it was the end of the carrier. The first to be hit is Kaga. It was hit by 4 bombs, and 1 bomb hitting the bridge, directly killing all the command staff. It is soon totally on fire and dead in the water. The next to be hit was Soryu to the north. This hit with 3 bombs along the center line. All the planes and ordnance in the hangar decks start to cook off and explode. And it's looking like Akagi's going to get away, but at the last minute, 3 bombers turn on the Akagi and manage to score a single hit through the flight deck, and it's going to doom this ship too. In 5 minutes, the Kido-Butai, a force that had never known defeat, was wrecked. At 10:22, Japan was winning this war, but 5 minutes later, it was not. The Hiru is untouched and the only Japanese carrier left. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon is aboard the Hero and is now in tactical command of what's left of Kilauea. But everyone knows what you got to do next. This is decisive battle doctrine. This is offensive spirit. This is attack, attack, attack. So for Yamaguchi, there is only one option, and that is to attack. He orders an immediate attack, not with waiting to get everything right and launch a combined strike. He's going to send really a small strike of only 18 vowels and 6 zeros at the Americans. And they're going to find the Yorktown. At 12:05, the Yorktown is attacked by dive bombers, and they score 6 bomb hits on the Yorktown. That's a 72% hit rate for those Japanese pilots. The Japanese pilots observe the Yorktown on fire, dead in the water, and assume the Yorktown is doomed and fly home. In the meantime, Nagumo transfers from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, and he orders the Kilauea to sail closer to the American ships. He's going to hope to engage his escorts of cruisers, and he got 2 battleships. He wants a surface attack. And sailing closer is an example of target fixation. Keep in mind that Nagumo is giving away his advantage of having a longer strike range than the Americans. But he's doing that because he wants to still pull out a win somehow. Meanwhile, Yamamoto learns of the disaster, but just like Nagumo, he wants a surface attack. At 12:20, he orders ships from the other units to come to Kilauea's aid. He also orders the 2 carriers in Alaska to assist in Midway, but they're 1,300 miles away. However, even the forces that he's with are still going to take a day to get there. At 13:31, Yamaguchi orders his second attack with his remaining torpedo bombers. That's only 10 torpedo bombers and 6 zeros. They are told to make sure you don't bomb the aircraft carrier you already bombed, go to one of the other ones. However, the first carrier they find is not on fire, it is launching planes, and it is sailing at 19 knots, but it's the Yorktown. And it speaks to just how more impressive the U.S. damage control capabilities were, even in 1942. However, the Yorktown was again ravaged by these experienced Japanese pilots. It hit by 4 torpedoes. And this would prove to be fatal. By 1500, the captain orders the ship to be abandoned. Finally, after they realize that it is 2-1, that they hit the Yorktown for a second time, and they only have 4 dive bombers and 5 torpedo bombers left for another strike, they decide to turn to the northwest and sail away. But they want to launch one more strike. But everyone's totally exhausted by this point, so they're going to have a meal and take a rest. But the Americans arrive at that time. At 1700, U.S. carrier-based planes attack Hiryu. 40 Dauntless dive bombers reach a totally fatigued combat air patrol, and in 10 minutes score 4 hits on Hiryu, and she is doomed. The next morning, a Japanese pilot snaps these photos over Hiryu. Yamaguchi decides to go down with his ship and stays aboard as the ship is abandoned. I want to point out that this is the elevator into the hangar deck. It has been blown out and up on top of the ship. That is huge explosions going down inside the hangar decks. Here's another picture of the Hiryu. It will later sink in a few hours after these ships, after these pictures are taken at 0900. But it ain't over. Yamamoto still wants to attack. Even with Hiryu out of action, he's hoping for a night attack. The Japanese are very skilled at night surface attack tactics. But this is finally canceled at midnight once he learns that the American ships have left. The American ships, the carriers, Task Force 16 is the only one left. They realize they've done what they were sent to do. They ambushed, destroyed Kilauea, and now they're getting out of there. They do not want a surface attack with the Japanese combined fleet. Operation MI is canceled, and the Aleutian invasion is ordered to proceed. This is what really matters, the most important part of the Japanese fleet to the Americans. Kilauea. It was destroyed thanks to this decisive battle strategy, overconfidence in sending only 4 carriers to invade an island and destroy your enemy, and devising a plan based on what you thought the enemy would do and not what the enemy could do. And refusing to admit defeat after your first 3 carriers were sunk. Could have saved that 4th one. Let's look at the casualties. So you can see that Kaga and Soryu had the worst casualties. They had the most hits. What's really critical is that mechanics and engineers are going to be much more difficult to replace, and they're the ones who died in the greatest quantity. It's not just about airmen. And over half the airmen in this battle, they survive. So they're going to fight again. And what's not on this list is there are another 900 sailors killed on other ships in this battle for 3,000 Japanese lives lost. Only 307 Americans died at Midway. So what did the Japanese learn from this battle to modify their doctrine? They're going to emphasize air reconnaissance and searches from carrier planes. There's going to be less emphasis on getting that combined strike. Some strike planes from now on will be always kept on deck, ready to launch. And when a carrier is detected, an enemy carrier, they're going to launch that strike as soon as they can with whatever they have ready, and they're not going to wait. They're also going to operate their carriers further apart. And they're going to send a vanguard force of cruisers and battleships out in front of their carriers to detect the air attacks. Remember, they still don't have radar. And hopefully absorb those air attacks. But finally, in assessing Midway's importance, the defeat was so disastrous for Japan, particularly for the Navy. The Japanese Navy hid the details from the Army for months and kept it secret from the civilians for the rest of the war. They even created a cabinet-level position, a minister without portfolio, just to prevent this from leaking. This marked a turning point of the military gaslighting its people. The Japanese Navy would not replace those 4 carriers they lost until 1944, but by then it's too late. In that same amount of time, the Americans commissioned 24 new fleet and light carriers and also 124 escort carriers. This loss of Japan's most important offensive tool, Kilauea, was an unforced error, thrown away much earlier than it would have taken the Americans to destroy it. The Americans were now in a position to go on the offensive and launch a war of attrition, which Japan could never win. But was Midway a turning point? Absolutely. But was it the decisive battle? I don't know. I think if the United States lost Midway, they would still win the war. If you believe the American victory was inevitable, then Midway was not a decisive battle. Midway is an example of brutal military culture that had developed one of the most fearsome weapons of the war, Kilauea. And yet it is unnecessarily sacrificed at Midway due to a lack of cohesive strategy, slavish adherence to an outdated decisive battle doctrine, and Yamamoto's fundamentally flawed battle plan. But this photo of a very young kamikaze pilot reminds us the worst is yet to come for both the Japanese military and the civilians they sought to protect. Thank you.
think we have some time for questions, Ben.
Great. Paul?
And I read that the weather was cloudy on that day, and they had trouble finding each other to set the beach.
Yeah, that float plane from the Chicama was actually couldn't see the fleet because of heavy cloud cover. What is interesting is the cloud cover was over the American task forces early today, but then it blown and helped conceal Hiryu from attack later in the day.
Hey, Ben, we have a request from the streaming group here. They want you to repeat the questions.
Oh, sorry, the question was cloud cover a factor? It was. The clouds helped the Americans in the beginning of the battle, then helped conceal Hiryu towards the end of the battle.
Yeah, first I want to thank you very much for doing this. This is awesome, getting After Dark from the park back. But second, as a kid, I was raised by a World War II veteran of the Pacific Theater, and my father's friends often talked about aircraft from both sides trying to accidentally land on each other's carriers in the dark, and I never knew if that was really true or not.
Yes, there's several famous examples of that. The first occurrence was actually the Battle of Coral Sea.
We need the question to be.
Oh, sorry. I'm new at this. The question was, were there instances of enemy planes landing on enemy, or planes landing on enemy carriers by mistake? And yes, I'm aware of that happening on Coral Sea. 3 Japanese planes were trying to land on, I don't know if it was the Yorktown or the Enterprise, and they got a hot reception and flew away. It did happen. Yeah.
Code is 0 in the illusions.
The 0 in the illusions?
There was a Japanese 0 that was damaged in the attack on
Dutch Harbor?
Illusion Island at sea. No. Dutch Harbor. And he turned around and flew back to the carrier, but couldn't make it because his engine was running out of oil. And so the alternate landing site was this crater on one of the Aleutian Islands, and he attempted to land there with his gear down, and it flipped upside down and killed him. And the plane remained there for months before somebody spotted it. And then they went out to recover it, and they turned it upside down and dragged it off the island and sent it all the way back through the Panama Canal to the eastern coast and restored it and started flying it.
Yeah, the gentleman was mentioning that in the Battle of the Aleutians, the air raid over Dutch Harbor, a Japanese fighter actually crash landed, was killed, but the 0 fighter plane was recovered by the Americans, repaired, and then I'm familiar with this, they used it to study how to defeat it.
Yes, and they found the Achilles heel because the 0 was so light and maneuverable, they could whip onto some heavier airplane's tail and shoot them. So what they found out was that if you got the American plane to go as fast as possible, put it in a dive at full power, and then roll right, you'd lose it.
Yeah, and one of the things they learned is that if you're being chased by 0, flew down at high speed, banked to the right, the 0 couldn't handle that type of maneuver. That's one of the things they learned. Thanks, I didn't know that.
In the last slide, you said that they hid what happened from the civilian. And I was wondering how high did they hide it all the way at very high-ranking people on the civilian line didn't know what happened, or was it more like the public that didn't know?
I think both to an extent. You know, they didn't even tell the Army, and the Army was running the country.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. Man, I'm not good at this. The question was the cover-up after the battle in the Japanese government. How high did that go? It certainly initially was very high because the Navy wouldn't let the Army know, and the Army was, in command of the country in the form of General Tojo. But once they found out, they created a cabinet level position just to keep it secret. So by then it was at the very top, and it was more widely known. They admitted to 1 carrier sunk and 1 cruiser sunk, is what they publicly admitted in that battle.
After this battle, the Japanese battle doctrine changed very significantly. Did the U.S. battle doctrine change from what was perceived at the time a decisive victory on their part?
The question was, the Japanese doctrine changed very significantly after the battle. Did the American battle doctrine change significantly? I would say yes. This was, in a way, the Americans were learning how to do this. I mentioned that the Japanese took 10 minutes to launch 108 planes. It took the Americans more than an hour to do that. So they really have a lot of learning. There's only going to be a couple more carrier battles in 42, and then there's no carrier battles at all in 1943. So by the time you have the next major carrier battle in 44, it's an entirely new Navy. You know, they commissioned 24 ships. They have really transformed one of the things John Parshall writes about is throw weight of anti-aircraft fire. It increased by a factor of 10 on the American ships. They were putting so much more lead into the air. They had proximity fuses on their 5-inch guns. It was just totally different Navy in 44 than it was in 42 for the Americans. Any more questions? Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that the Japanese didn't rotate their flight crews, and therefore they didn't have that training. Was that an hindrance for them? Whereas I assume the Americans were rotating and sending experienced people to do training.
Yeah, the question was if the Japanese were not rotating their experienced aviators out to be instructors. That was a really bad move for them because they're not passing on that information. And were the Americans doing that? Yes, they were. The Americans did not consider the plane and the ship to be one unit. That means the aviator was not necessarily a Yorktown sailor or an Enterprise sailor, whereas the aviator on the Hiryu was a Hiryu aviator. They were like interchangeable parts, and they actually had a lot more than the Americans, a lot more air groups than they had carriers for this very purpose, because you could have a battle and that air group could be wiped out, as there were at Midway. And then you could just pick up another one and put it in its place like a Lego. And that was a really smart tactic or strategy for the Americans. But the Japanese, as you saw, Shokaku and Zuikaku, they didn't make that switch. And as a consequence, they weren't at the battle. And as pilot attrition ramps up in 42, and as they start to send more and more of their experienced pilots to these just attritional battles in the Solomons, they are losing their most knowledgeable aviators, draining the ability to fight the Americans. And so by 44, when you have the Battle of the Philippine Sea, there's almost no experienced aviators in the air. They put 400 green as the grass aviators, and they're just mowed down by the Americans in that battle.
But the loss of experienced aviators, did that prompt the introduction of the kamikaze concept?
Yeah, the question was, did the loss of experienced aviators prompt the kamikaze? Yes, I absolutely think so. That's an act of desperation. It also shows what, they don't really care about these young men, and it's still a way to attack, because that's what the doctrine is, attack. So it's an offensive action, but you don't have to train them to defend themselves. They're just going, they're missiles. And so it is absolutely a consequence of no longer being able to defend ships or islands from the American aviators.
I think we've got time for one more question then.
You mentioned 3 sources that were originally used, and one of them was a book written by a Japanese fellow. Do you have an example of something inaccurate that was thought as?
Yes, it's a great question. The book by Fushida Matsuo, what was one of the inaccuracies? He wrote famously, and this is in the 1976 movie of Midway, that we were about to launch our strike. Everyone was on deck, we were spotted, the planes were warmed up, we were right there, and then those devastators came out and blew us up. And that wasn't true.
Do you think that was a continuation of the gaslighting?
I think it was, to speculate, why did he write that? I think it was a way to defend some of the leadership, like Yamamoto in particular, Nagumo, that we were this close to winning this battle. And they weren't. They were all below deck. They were doing cap evolutions there in that time. And they were not close to winning at 1022.
Wow, thank you so much. Isn't it incredible? It's awesome. I can only speak for myself, but if I had had a history professor like that, I would know a lot more. I would have paid more attention. So if you didn't get any questions answered that you really wanted to say, but we were running out of time on our hour for the live stream, Ben will stay here. So after the program, by all means, come up and ask him. For our next After Dark in the Park, it'll be on June 20th. Many of you know the Thomas Jagger Museum and HVO facility was damaged beyond repair in the 2018 earthquakes. And you might be wondering what the plans are for that and what the history of that area was. We're going to have our very own Dr. Jadalyn Moniz Nakimura. She's going to take us on a journey through the past sacred place known as Uekahuna, the evolution of the area, and the dramatic eve of the park's efforts to restore a more natural view to that landscape. So join us for June 20th. Have a wonderful evening.